Could Putin really use nuclear weapon? Turkey's foreign minister Hakan Fidan has said that Russia could use nuclear weapon if the war becomes an existential threat to the Kremlin. In other words, if the war stops being a conflict mainly inside Ukraine and starts seriously threatening Russia itself, Putin could see nuclear weapon as a last option. And when you heard something like this from the foreign minister of a NATO country, the first question is pretty simple. Could Putin really press the button? I live here in Kyiv, and I think Ukrainians see the question a little differently from people in the West, because we have already seen Russia do things that just a few months earlier many people were almost impossible. Before February 2022, a lot of people, including me, simply did not believe Russia would launch a full-scale invasion. It just did not make sense. I thought, why would Putin start such a huge war if he know what the consequences would be? Well, Putin saw the situation very differently. He expected a quick operation. Instead, he got a war that has now lasted for years. So I'm very careful when someone says Putin would never do that because it makes no sense. Maybe it makes no sense to us. But the real question is, does it make sense to Putin? And here I would separate two different questions. First, could Russia use nuclear weapon? Yes. Second, would Putin actually have a good military reason to use them? And that answer is much more complicated. US intelligence has looked at this question many times. In 2023, US Director of National Intelligence Heinzer said that Russia using nuclear weapon was very unlikely. And in 2024, Reuters reported that US intelligence still saw a nuclear escalation as unlikely. That does not mean the risk is zero, but it's important because Putin talks about nuclear weapons a lot. Russian officials keep reminding the West about Russia's nuclear arsenal. Russia has changed its nuclear doctrine. Russia has also moved nuclear weapon into Belarus, according to Moscow. And Russia keeps holding nuclear exercises. But the fact that Russia talks about nuclear weapons all the time does not mean it's planning to use them. I think there is one very simple way to understand this. For Putin, nuclear weapons may not just be weapon. They can also be a tool of pressure, and that matter, because if you can make your enemy afraid of nuclear weapons, you may not actually need to use them. You already get a political effect. Ukraine gets new weapon. Russia says, be careful, this could lead to nuclear war. Ukraine gets permission to use West weapons against target in Russia. Again, we hear nuclear threats. The West talks about giving Ukraine more military support. Again, Moscow talks about nuclear weapons. This works as a psychological tool, and I think is a very important part of the story. But then we have another question. What would Russia actually gain from using a nuclear weapon? Let's imagine the simple situation. Russia uses a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield. What happened next? Yes, it could destroy troops or equipment in a certain area, but would it actually change the war? This is where some military experts make a very interesting point. And Arnold from the Royal United Service Institute has agreed that tactical nuclear weapons are not some kind of magic weapon. Their effect is still limited to a certain area, and many of the military targets Russia could want to destroy can already be attacked with conventional weapons. So there's a very simple problem. Why use a nuclear weapon if you can try to achieve the same military goal with a missile and an air strike or artillery? But the political cost would be completely different. You would cross the nuclear line, and after that nobody really knows what happened next. That is why nuclear weapon can have huge value as a threat, but their real military value is this war may be such smaller than many people think. And now let's look at Belarus. Putin announced that Russia would deploy a tactical nuclear weapon in Belarus back in 2023. Moscow later said that the weapons had been moved there. And in 2025, Belarus also showed the deployment of Russia Oreshnik missile, which can carry nuclear warheads. At first, this sounds extremely dangerous. Russia is moving part of its nuclear capability closer to NATO. But if you look at it more keenly, this again looks a lot like a tool for pressure. Russia can threaten targets in Europe more quickly, but that does not automatically give Moscow some new military power that completely change the war. So again, the weapons are there, the nuclear capability is there, the threat is real, but there is a huge difference between having the weapon and deciding to use it. And this brings us to China. For me, this is one of the most important parts of the whole story, because Russia don't exist in a vacuum.